If you think about the kind of events that are going on around the world, corporate media tends to turn it on its head with the real news that was sort of interesting. It's actually turned things back on its feet so that you can actually understand the reason for certain types of events.
Welcome back to the next part of our interview with Eric Margolis, journalist and member of the International Institute of Strategic Studies, and a contributing editor to the American Conservative magazine. His latest book, American Raj, Liberation or Domination, reflects on what he describes as the conflict between the West and the Muslim world. And you can get American Raj when you donate to the Real News Network. If you sort of click somewhere on our site, you'll find out how. Thanks for joining us again. So Eric, if one looks at the reality of the real behavior, actions of Egypt, of the other Arab governments, and of Israel, and the PA for that matter, everyone doesn't seem to mind too much if Israel is successful in wiping out Hamas. Is that true? And if so, why?
Yes, it is true, because Hamas is regarded by the U.S.-backed governments in the Middle East as a dire threat, because these are mainly monarchies or dictatorships. They're run by, they're oligarchies. They do very little for their people, except for the oil states. The Hamas is coming along with a revolutionary message: share the wealth, we'll take care of the people, fight corruption, fight dishonesty, stand up to Israel, stop licking the hands of the Americans. This is not what these people want to hear. So there was a collusion between the United States, Israel, Egypt, and Britain to lock up Gaza, put it under siege, and try and crush the life out of Hamas. And that, I believe, we'll see in the next few days how successful the Israelis are at doing this.
So the strategy seems to be, in the last days of the Bush administration, because if the Israelis had done this on Obama's new watch, this would have been rather difficult for him politically. But right now, they've got a dead duck president. They get this done, and is this somehow setting the plate for what will be Obama able to bring in a new two-state solution where the Hamas is not a player because essentially the leadership is dead?
Well, quite right. I wrote this a couple of weeks ago, in fact, that Israel's, first of all, I think this is Bush's last act. Just when we think he couldn't do any more damage, he's loosed this Parthian shaft into the heart of the Middle East.
Well, he promised us a peace agreement before the end of his term. And maybe this is
a Carthaginian peace.
This is a peace agreement when your enemy is dead.
They make a desert and call it peace. And this is what I think Bush gave the green light for this Israeli attack. I think this was planned, and they're hurrying up to finish it while Bush is in office. But also, Israel is presented the new Obama administration with a fait accompli, and that is that there will be no Hamas. There will be no peace talks except on our terms, that the PLO, Palestinian Authority, which has become a lapdog of the Israelis and the Americans, will do whatever we tell them to do. And there will be no major Israeli withdrawal from useful parts of the West Bank. So here Obama, Obama's really, his hands are tied now, because any plans he might have had to try and nudge Israel into a more generous peace agreement with the Palestinians is now going to be over, and there's an uproar in the Middle East. The whole peace process has been set back for years.
I mean, I wonder if it can work another way, which is that if the idea is to have a Palestinian state, more or less under the suzerainty of Israel, at least a very weak state, maybe the table is set for that now, is with Hamas so weak. In theory, if they even had a referendum or election, Hamas might not be in a position to do much of anything about it. Does this actually, at least in their minds, there being in the Israeli and American minds, actually set the conditions for what the kind of two-state solution they want to see?
Oh, absolutely. Israel,
so we might actually see something very early in the Obama.
We might, but it's my also belief that while they can impose something on the rental leaders in Palestine, that the Palestinian people will rise up eventually and reject a patently unfair agreement. What we're seeing now in Gaza reminds me of the Battle of Algiers during the Algerian independence war against France, where the elite units were sent in to clear out the Kasbah and this warren of narrow streets in Algiers. to hunt down the leaders of the FLN independence fighters and kill them, use informers to capture them, torture them, and squeeze them, and break them and destroy the FLN organization. This is what's happening now. So if Hamas can be destroyed, literally, and most of its senior members killed, that leaves only the PLO, which will agree to Israel's plan, which is quite clear, as I pointed out in my book, American Raj, that they want to set up sort of like almost tribal reservations where there are large areas of Palestine population, keep the most useful parts of the West Bank for Jewish settlements, and leave the Palestinians completely surrounded in these sort of South African-style Bantustans. Even if there is a viable Palestinian state that somehow emerges, it will still remain an Israeli protectorate, because the Israelis plan to monitor all of its entrances and exits and its airspace and land and sea space. So a Palestinian state is fated to become an Israeli protectorate.
There's a lot of talk right now about the possibility of a third intifada, and I guess we'll have to see how the Palestinian people respond to this. But is there any reason to expect any fundamental change or even incremental change in U.S. attitudes towards Israel and the Palestinians from the Obama administration?
Well, from what little we've seen so far, I would tend to say no, which I find unfortunate because new ideas are desperately needed. And again, as I point out in my book, you know, the whole America's hated in the Muslim world primarily because of what's happened in Palestine. And yet here we go and flatten Gaza with American weapons and American arms and American support, because America's been blocking international intervention as it did in Lebanon in 2006. So we desperately need new ideas.
So let's say Obama, in some very strange moment at 3 a.m, says, "Oh my God, I have to talk to Eric Margolis." What would you suggest to him? What should be the U.S. policy towards the region?
Well, to press Israel to bring out its best side, that is to be more accommodating in its negotiations and try and really develop a viable Palestinian state with some dignity and workability to it, and to start offering peace gestures to the Arabs. You know, the Arab League, all 22 members, offered Israel full peace, full recognition, integration into the Muslim world if it would agree to the Saudi peace plan of going back to the borders of 1967.
But the Israeli governments, whichever party, just seems completely unwilling to take on this question of the settlements. There's hundreds of thousands.
That's correct.
Of settlers would have to be moved. There'd be at least a kind of mini civil war they would have to fight. And they seem unwilling to do it.
Israel is unwilling to withdraw from the West Bank and the Golan Heights. I mean, that's really the bottom line. Israel's elite establishment and military establishment is unwilling to do so. Many Israelis are urging this to happen, but their voices are being ignored, both by Washington and both in Israel right now. So Washington needs to nurture the forces of peace and damp down these people who want to maintain a greater Israel, which is going to be damaging to Israel in the long run, because it's going to end up with a majority Palestinian population who are sullen, resentful, and rebellious.
Which even Omar talks about as probably the biggest threat to Israel.
As the demographic time bomb, as they call it. But with President Obama, the problem is that he's already given commitments to the Israel lobby in the United States, and saying we'll never divide Jerusalem. Well, this is a key part to any settlement.
Everybody I've talked to who supports Obama all says you do what you have to do to get elected. So I guess we'll see. This will be a litmus test. Will Obama actually take on the greater Israel lobby, whether it's in Israel or the United States, or will he question some of those traditional assumptions of U.S. foreign policy?
Well, this Gaza thing comes curiously just as there was growing movement towards peace, both among Israeli leaders and even some of the senior leaders now, like Olmert, were talking about accepting the Saudi peace plan, or at least considering it, and even Ehud Barak. And there was movement in the American Jewish community to start considering something of a peace plan. And along comes this Gaza thing, which could have been done at another time too. There was nothing urgent about it except that Bush was leaving. But we've seen, as this Gaza thing went on, that Obama has remained mute, except for a couple of platitudes. And he has spoken on other foreign affairs issues. His silence is dismaying up to this point, and the appointments that he's made don't suggest that there's going to be any change in American Middle East policy.
Well, in just a matter of days, he'll be President Obama, and certainly the first foreign policy piece on his agenda will be what is he going to do about Palestine and Israel. And so we'll judge him then. Thanks for joining us, Eric.
You're welcome.
And thank you for joining us for this series of interviews with Eric Margolis. Once again, American Raj is available. If you like to donate to The Real News, this is one of the gifts we will give you for donating. Thanks for joining us.